right, happy Sunday, everybody. This is Jenna Rovira bringing back another chapter from the $80 Champion. Hope y'all are having an amazing day. This week we are going into Chapter 7. It's called How to Make a Living at Horses in High Point, North Carolina, 1951. Harry was 22 years old. He and his wife, Johanna, part of a wave of post-war immigrants who came to the United States from Europe when the Dutch flagship Volendam pulled into the port of Hoboken in August 1950. Out of about 2 million new immigrants who arrived into the United States between 1950 and 1960, some 52,000 were from Holland, or about 5,000 Dutch immigrants each year. The early 1950s was a time of brash new developments that would forever change the face of the country, the biggest of them being the advent of television. In 1951, Edward R. Murrow debuted his television show, See It Now, by showing a split-screen image of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge, the first time the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had ever been seen simultaneously. In 1950, Diners Club introduced the first credit card, and Xerox manufactured the first copy machine. The cost of a gallon of gasoline was 18 cents. But it was also a fearful time. The Korean War had started, introducing a new era of Cold War tensions. In April 1951, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were sentenced to death as communist spies. These years would be dominated by international tensions and technological changes that arrived at a breathtaking, sometimes terrifying pace. But like generations of immigrants before them, Harry and Johanna were undeterred by the uncertainties of the future. They knew hardship firsthand, and they arrived with the intention of building a good life for themselves in this new land. Harry and Johanna's families had scraped together enough money for the first-class passage that was to be their honeymoon. But when the young couple arrived in America, they had only $160 between them. The 6-day crossing had been rough, and Harry had spent most of it curled up below decks feeling seasick. Hoboken, just across the Hudson River from New York City, was a loud, clanking urban port. As they debarked, it was hard for the young newlyweds not to be overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sights and sounds. Before arriving in Hoboken, Harry and Johanna had passed through Ellis Island, where immigration inspectors had cleared their papers and performed a brief medical exam. At the port in Hoboken, the customs inspectors cracked the lid of the small wooden crate that held all of the young couple's belongings. They did not have much. Harry and Johanna stood by as an inspector prodded at its meager contents. Harry's worn leather saddle and his tall riding boots took up much of the space. The inspector made no comment and closed the lid. The official proceedings complete, Harry and Johanna stepped off the ship into their new homeland without a backward glance. Before the war, it would have been unthinkable that Harry, the oldest son of a prosperous brewer, would someday be standing with his wife on the dock in Hoboken with little more than his hopes and dreams in one small wooden crate. But for the war, Harry's future would have been assured. No one who saw them that day, walking tentatively through the port, would have imagined that this young man had shown such an exceptional gift for horses that he had already ridden before the Queen of Holland. The couple's clothes were plain. They spoke little English, and they carried little with them, but they had a bright look in their eyes. Although, somewhere deep in that crate lay a single photo album from home. Right from that first day in Hoboken, the couple kept their eyes fixed on the future. They boarded the train south, headed toward a new life that they were determined to embrace. Their patron, Bill McCormick grew tobacco on a farm outside of High Point, North Carolina. The sharecroppers' deal seemed more than generous to Harry and Johanna. Accustomed to tiny Dutch farms, the new immigrants saw the large tobacco fields stretch out to the horizon with promise. The sharecropping system was simple. The owner gave the aspiring farmer land to work, housing, and enough capital to plant, expecting him, in turn, to split his profits 50-50. In the sleepy rural area, life seemed to roll along as it had for nearly a century. The sharecropping system dated back to post-Civil War period. Then white farmers had leased fields to newly freed slaves, capitalizing on their labor without sharing ownership of the land. Tobacco farms were not highly mechanized. They commonly used mules in the fields, horses for general farm work, and large amounts of manpower. Here we have Harry in the front on the right, carrying the flag of St. Odenrode in the parade to celebrate the Queen of Holland's return from exile in 1945. Get a little closer. There we go. But after the Second World War, the American farm economy had started going through tumultuous changes. In the post-war boom times, many black sharecroppers had left the land and migrated to industrial jobs in the North. Already 1950 was shaping up as a weak year for farmers, with overall profits down 10% nationwide. With the recent technological advances, production had increased, but the need for labor had lessened. As the demand for farm labor decreased nationwide, Mexican farm workers in the western United States were increasingly accused of, quote-unquote, stealing jobs, culminating in the controversial Operation Wetback in 1954, when more than 400,000 migrant workers were involuntarily repatriated to Mexico. The farm problem was at the top of most politicians' agendas. Small farms were consolidating, workers were leaving or being pushed off farms, and the cost of government subsidies to farmers was skyrocketing. The entire way of life that underpinned the farm was being challenged from all directions. But when Harry and Johanna arrived, they knew nothing of the complicated economic, social, and political forces that swirled around farming at mid-century. They only knew that they were hard-working, and they intended to make a go of it in their new land. Workers' cabins were lined up in a row along the farm's edge. Harry and Johanna's new home had been fashioned from rough plank boards. Standing inside, you could see gaps through some of the walls, straight to the outside. Harry worked in the fields from sun-up to sunset, while Johanna tried to spruce the place up despite their small budget, sewing curtains and making cushions. They lived carefully on their meager capital, expecting that in November, when the tobacco crop came in and was sold at auction, they would reap a good reward. The tobacco country in Guilford County, North Carolina, was nothing like St. Odenrode, the close-knit traditional Dutch village where Harry and Johanna had grown up. But they had appreciated the buoyant mood in America. The Dutch countryside had been ravaged by the war, and the post-war atmosphere in Europe was pessimistic. Loss and destruction had marred the landscape that people had known and loved. Fortunes had been lost, villages torn apart. Across the ocean, the United States beamed like a beacon, a place where peace reigned, the homeland of the brave young men who had risked their lives to come to the Dutch people's aid. It wasn't easy to get a visa to the United States. Most young Dutch immigrants had gone to Canada, where the government had extended an open hand to people with a background in farming. Growing up, Harry had believed that he would lead a life much like his father's, while he wasn't interested in the brewery business, he loved the farm. As the oldest son, he'd assumed he would take it over. But after the war, so much had changed. The farms needed to be rebuilt, and the economy was sagging. In his boyhood, Harry had worked harder than anyone to help his father keep the farm running. The farm and the brewery went hand in hand. The crops fed the animals and provided the hops for the beer. The one couldn't survive without the other. But after the war, without horses to work the land, the fields had lain fallow, and the whole farm had fallen into disarray. I'm going to go back up here. Harry's father astride his horse. This is at the church in St. Odin Road in the background. There's the church, and there's a close-up of Harry's father. Then a year or two after the war ended, just when things were starting to look a little better, a tornado swept through the town, knocking over trees and littering the fields with debris. The next morning, Harry, then 18, and his younger brother Jan, 13, headed out to clean up their land. Harry took 2 horses over to a field that needed plowing. Jan took a third to where the big cultivator had been left the day before. A short while later, Harry looked up, confused, to see Jan's horse galloping toward him, unhitched, with his brother nowhere in sight. Harry left his team and ran to the next field. Jan lay on the ground, unconscious. A tree branch had downed an electric wire, and some part of the metal cultivator must have been touching it. When Jan had grabbed the machine, a powerful electric shock had jolted him. Harry ran back to the farmhouse, shouting as he ran. The family poured outside to come to their aid. Pale and silent, Jan lay in a coma for days. Each day the village doctor came around to check on him, but he said little, and often just shook his head. The family waited in tense vigil, watching the handsome, fair-haired boy, hoping for some sign that he was going to take a turn for the better. They prayed and lit candles, watched and waited, and after a few days, their prayers were answered. Jan opened his eyes and began to speak. It was a slow process, but he would eventually get better, making almost a full recovery. Jan had been a quick boy and good with his studies, but after the accident, he struggled in school. He was still good with the farm work and the animals, but he was no longer able to learn the way that he had. And here we have Harry's mother on the left with some of his 12 brothers and sisters. Can you imagine? It had always been expected by the entire family that Harry, as the eldest son, would take over the farm. But Jan, like Harry, had always been interested in farming, and Harry could see that Jan was going to need it more than he did. When Harry thought of leaving his homeland behind, he took strength from the idea of the American paratroopers he had met. They were cocksure and courageous. The young Dutch boys had flocked around them, eager to help them fight the Nazis any way they could. Now, the only soldiers left in St. Odin Road were dead ones. The field where Harry used to practice his horseback riding had been turned into a graveyard, donated by Harry's father to the Catholic Church when its cemetery overflowed with war casualties. After the war, the village girls took it upon themselves to lovingly tend the fallen soldiers' graves. A good student who had learned some English, Harry's sister wrote letters to the families of some of the fallen American soldiers to let them know that their graves were being cared for. One of them, Nicky Schultz, had come from part of America they had never heard of, Greensboro, North Carolina. Neither Harry nor Johanna had met Nicky Schultz when he was alive, but they had met other soldiers, young men, who were friendly and brave. Nicholas Corbin Schultz a first lieutenant in the Army's 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, had been killed in action on September 18, 1944. Harry's sister hoped that her letter would bring comfort to the family. She wanted them to know that his sacrifice had not been forgotten. I'm going to go back up here. The St. Odin Road Riding Club meetings on the field that the Leyer family later donated to the church to expand its cemetery. Harry, age 16, is on foot on the far right. He had recently earned his riding instructor's certificate. So this looks like the young Harry. Ja, Harry would not mind moving to a place where people like that hailed from. He learned that Canada was accepting Dutch immigrants with agricultural backgrounds, so he applied for a visa and started saving every penny for his move. But shortly after Harry's sister mentioned to the American family that Harry would be moving to Canada, a telegram arrived in St. Odin Road. The Schultz family would sponsor him to come to America. There was only one thing left to do. Harry had been sweet on Johanna for years. Her brothers rode with Harry in the 4-H riding club. Johanna was a brown-haired beauty who loved the same things that Harry did, animals, and especially horses. Johanna's sister had already immigrated to America, and when Harry talked about going there, Johanna's eyes shone as though she too could imagine the fields that stretched out as far as the horizon. Now, in spite of the dirt and the heat and humidity far greater than he had ever known, in spite of the rough cabin with the cracks in the walls, in spite of the hard hours of work between sunrise and sunset, Harry and Johanna attacked their new life with the vigor particular to those who have known hardship. Harry did not mind field work. He had been doing it all his life, but he missed taking care of the animals, and most of all, he missed the horses. He would never forget the flying sensation of jumping in a huge arena festooned with bunting and bursting with the sounds of a brass band. Those cherished memories helped him get through his days. Harry wiped his sweaty brow and got on with his work. In the afternoons, Harry often walked a quarter-mile down the road to help out at his neighbor's dairy. Calvin Ross ran a small ice business and a farm. He had a gas-powered engine to blow the hay up into the silos, but he used a horse-drawn wagon to pull the corn in from the fields. Harry offered to drive the wagon. He enjoyed being around the animals, and the dairy with its predictable rhythms reminded him of life back home. Life in St. Odin Road had been marked by activities that changed with the seasons, swimming in the summer and ice skating in the winter when the ponds froze over. Every spring, the children had gotten excited when the circus came to town, bringing the Cossacks, Russian riders who performed tricks and daring feats on horseback. One day, Cal told Harry to set aside the weekend so that he could drive him to the North Carolina State Fair. Harry had never seen so many tractors in one place. He and Cal walked around with awe, looking at the contraptions. In the early 1950s, there were still many small family farms in America, and many of those farms still used horses to pull their plows. The fancy tractors cut down on the time necessary to work the fields, making farming more efficient, but they also required much more capital. A tractor was many times more expensive than a horse. The shiny tractors and farm equipment that Harry and Cal admired that day would soon permanently change the face of American farming, as small family farms were sold off and consolidated, leaving in their place large industrial farms with sufficient money to invest in farm equipment. Back at Cal's farm, horses still did much of the work, Nobody had thought to use the work horses for riding, but one day Harry caught one out in the field and saddled him up. The ride was rough, but solid. Experimenting with all 3 horses and making makeshift fences from old posts and rails, Harry found that one of them could even jump a bit. He called the mare Petra, after the beloved horse he had left behind in Holland. People scratched their heads at the sight of Harry and Petra out in the fields late in the afternoons, when everyone else wanted nothing more than to relax in the shade with a cold beer. They couldn't help but stare at the young man, dirty and sunburned from being outside all day, riding in the field on the clunky old plow horse. Still, if a person who knew horses happened by, it was clear from the way the young man sat in the saddle, from his erect bearing, the ease and suppleness in his back, and the light hands on the reins, that this man knew how to ride. The language he spoke to the horses was mostly silent, but sometimes he muttered a few words in Dutch, circling around, galloping and jumping, and for a few minutes Harry could forget everything and recapture that feeling of flying. Afterward, he groomed the horse carefully, gave her an extra measure of grain, and then released her into the pasture. Tomorrow, he would hitch her up to the wagon to lug corn to the silo, and he knew the horse would plod along as quietly as before. But just because you are hitched to a burden does not mean that you do not sometimes want to fly. The entry fee for the local horse show was $3. It bought a rider the chance to vie for a $10 prize. For Harry and Johanna, the cost was an extravagance, but riding mattered to Harry. Deep down in his bones, he worked so hard all the time, they reasoned, that it couldn't hurt for him to ride in the show. The old plow horse didn't stand a chance, but Harry groomed her as though she were a top thoroughbred. Back home in Holland, the same horses who pulled the plows and carriages were saddled up and ridden to horse shows on the weekends. This seemed normal to Harry. He dug out his riding breeches and jacket from the suitcase, and Johanna carefully mended and ironed them. He blacked his tall boots and slicked down his hair. Harry was ready to go. There are no photographs to record the moment when Harry de Leyer arrived at his first horse show on American soil. He was riding an old workhorse, and his clothing was correct but simple. But he had taught the horse well, and Harry brought home the blue ribbon and the $10 prize in the open jumper class. Johanna, standing at the railing, was mostly excited about the money, which would help pay for much-needed baby things. They were expecting their first child. But someone else stood near the railing that day, a savvy Irishman named Mickey Walsh. With his broad smile, white linen jacket, and bow tie, Mickey was an immediately recognizable figure. Irish through and through, the 50-year-old had wavy gray hair set off by bright blue eyes. Between 1950 and 1955, Mickey Walsh was the first person to win a total of $1 million in the breakneck sport of steeplechasing, where horses compete at full speed over tall, solid timber fences. Now, at the very top of his game, Mickey had recently founded the Stony Brook Steeplechase in Southern Pines, North Carolina, a horse-centered community not far from McCormick's farm. Like many professional horsemen, Mickey had come up the hard way, born into a family that had been in the horse business for generations. Mickey left home as a young man to seek his fortune in the United States. But he arrived in New York at a time when prejudice against Irishmen abounded and signs declared, "No Irish needed" apply, were emblazoned on shop windows throughout the city. Mickey finally found a job leading out horses in Central Park until he managed to parlay his horse skills into a better line of work on Long Island as a horseboy for some of the grand estates. Walsh soon became one of the most competitive jumper riders in the country, winning every major championship for a series of rich owners. That day in North Carolina, the dapper man with nimble, athletic build of a lifelong rider and the confident grin of someone used to winning looked up from whatever he was doing and saw a young fellow whose grace in the saddle was immediately apparent to an old salt like him. Maybe it takes a rider to know a rider, because Mickey, unfazed by Harry's plow horse mount in provincial Dutch riding habit, recognized him in an instant for what he was, a man with a gift. After Harry had secured his blue ribbon rosette and the prize money, the Irishman approached. Harry's understanding of English was still a bit rough, but he recognized the Irish brogue. "What do you do, young man?" Mickey asked. "I'm a farmer," Harry replied. "I work on a tobacco farm near Greensboro." "Ah, you're no farmer. You are a horseman. You should be working with horses." Harry's heart beat a little faster. He could not imagine anything better. But even here in a local show, Harry saw the kind of people who were involved in horses in the United States. Women in white gloves and hats with veils, and tweed-coated country squires whose farms were funded by the kind of sharecropping labor Harry did. He wasn't bitter. He was lucky to be in the United States, and he knew it. There were opportunities here, and a land that seemed full of hope and promise, not scarred by the sadness of the aftermath of war. But horses. Harry remembered the times when everyone else had gone home, when the sky was darkening behind the church in St. Odin Road, and he remained bone-sore in the saddle, working on one move, a flying lead change or a tight turn, always trying to improve. Harry knew that he could read a horse with just the touch of his fingers and the feel under his seat bones. He knew it absolutely. But he was also a family man now. His wife was going to have a baby. Horses were for fun, and the tobacco farm was where his livelihood lay. The Irishman looked at him with bright eyes and a broad, open smile. Harry tried to form the word no, but it just wouldn't come to him. He sat astride that old workhorse and for a moment, just one moment, allowed himself to imagine a better life, the life he really wanted. "I don't know if I'm good enough," Harry said. The blue-eyed man kept smiling. "Oh, you're good enough," he said. "I can tell you want to win more than most people, and believe me, son, that's all it takes." Riding back to Cal's farm at the end of the day, Harry felt tired, but satisfied. He had $10 in his pocket, and the words of the old man lodged somewhere deep in his breast. It was not until days later that Harry would discover that that friendly fellow was the legendary Mickey Walsh, the man who had started leading out ponies in Central Park and now an influential millionaire. Nonetheless, Harry turned over the words in his mind as he lay down to sleep that night, but he couldn't imagine wanting anything more than he wanted to ride. But rows and rows of shiny green tobacco plants were implanted behind his eyelids, and he and Johanna were all too aware that they needed that crop to do well, or they would be out of money. Harry was starting to understand that things didn't look good. Bill McCormick was a drinker who did not manage the farm well, and even worse, the summer season had been hot and dry. They needed rain, and a lot of it soon, or the crop would fail. In tobacco country, November is auction time. Ever since the Great Depression, the government had put in subsidies to support the price of the crop, but even so, there were great variations in the prices. Johanna was now 7 months pregnant, and their startup capital, the $160 they had saved in Holland, and brought with them as a nest egg, had almost been exhausted as the long, hot summer dragged into a dusty, dry fall. Each day, the locals searched the sky for rain that did not come. The glossy rows of tobacco started to shrivel and yellow. Eventually, Harry and Johanna had to face the truth. All of their hard work had come to nothing. The tobacco crop was worthless that year, and their 50% take of the crop ended up being 50% of nothing. It was time for them to look for work somewhere else. Harry needed a salary, however small, to keep them afloat. Harry had stayed in touch with Mickey Walsh, who promised to keep his eye out for work for Harry, but so far there'd been nothing. With the baby almost due, they realized they had no choice. Johanna's sister, who lived near Greensboro, offered to take them in while they waited for the baby to come. Harry continued to pick up odd jobs. It was the only work he could find. The bill for the hospital was $130, and Harry worked round the clock to get just that amount. Paying the hospital bill in full, in cash, cleaned them out. Their son Joseph, who quickly earned the nickname Chef, was born into uncertainty. Harry and Johanna just didn't know what their next move should be, and now they had another mouth to feed. With all the changes going on in the American farm economy, it was not a propitious time to be an immigrant trying to make a living in farming. In pre-war Holland, the farm and brewery had supported their entire family, but as Harry had quickly learned, the gulf between working as a hired hand and owning your own land was vast. All over the country, droves of young people were leaving the land behind for higher education of factory work. Farms that had been in families for generations were sold off. The land consolidated into fewer larger farms, the beginning of a long-term trend that by the 1980s would mark the virtual end of the family farm. When they'd stepped aboard the ship bound for America, it had never occurred to Harry that he would not be a farmer. He'd spent his entire life working the land, but times were changing. Harry and Johanna needed a place of their own. They could not keep imposing on Johanna's sister. Harry traipsed the streets, continually looking for work. The furniture factories in High Point were hiring. Harry scanned the ads, wondering if it was time to consider that kind of job. But Mickey Walsh had kept the young man in mind, and just when things were looking bleakest, the call came through. Mickey had recommended Harry for a position in a Pennsylvania riding stable, a job in horses. For the third time since arriving in Hoboken, Johanna and Harry packed up their suitcases and moved on. And there we go. Next week we go to Chapter 8, The Stable Boy. I can't even imagine traveling to a whole different country with no idea what is going on, but the story is just picking up and we get to find out more next week. Have a great weekend and take care, y'all. Bye.